Hello you, Guru Larry here, and I welcome you to a very special YouTube Geek Week retrospective on the history of 80s Doctor Who video games. We'll start with what technically has the accolade of being the first ever Doctor Who game. The imaginatively titled Doctor Who Adventure for the Atari 400 and 800. Called that because it's more or less a rip-off of the Atari 2600 game Adventure, and was released in the March 1984 issue of Computer and Video Games magazine. I say technically, as it's about as legitimate as a PlayStation copy of Halo, though that didn't stop CVG from stealing all the characters and artwork from the show. But in Doctor Who Adventure, at least according to the magazine cover, you play as a slightly confused looking Tom Baker, here pondering whether he's left the gas on in the TARDIS, who has chased the Master into a pyramid to retrieve parts of his stolen TARDIS that are being made into a time bomb. Unfortunately, I can't work out if it's supposed to be a pun, or the programmer clearly doesn't know what a time bomb actually is. But the only way to obtain all the TARDIS parts is to kill the Master. So, the story pretty much points out the authenticity of the product. By now, some of you might have noticed the game is glitchy and corrupted as all heck. In fact, entering some of the rooms causes the game to crash completely. That's quite possibly down to the fact this game was never physically released. It was actually a type-in in the March 1983 issue of Computer and Video Games magazine, and thus submitted to print by a rather enthusiastic teenager around that time. And of course, these were the days when beta testing meant being a guinea pig for experimental heart drugs. For those of you too young to remember type-ins, they were essentially the 1980s equivalent of DLC. You grab hold of your favourite gaming magazine, and towards the back would be several pages of code you could type in to have your very own game, which you spend a rainy Sunday afternoon typing into your computer. You'd then spend further hours looking for code you had entered incorrectly, and even after that they rarely ever worked. But this was what we called fun in the 1980s. So while Doctor Who Adventure isn't an official Doctor Who game, and barely works enough to warrant even being called a game, it was the first ever title to feature the man from Gallifrey, whether the BBC approved of it or not. Anyhow, as with most games of the time, rather than build an epic fantasy based on the Doctor's rich history, iconic enemies and ever-expansive Time Lord lore, they just went for the easier option and ripped off a bunch of arcade games instead. But you play as Peter Davison, the Fifth Doctor, across 5 possibly copyright-infringing levels, or episodes, as this game likes to call them. The first episode is The Labyrinth of Death, where this crosshair here, if you couldn't figure it out, is actually a Doctor riding a minecart. Yeah, just use your imagination. Who must traverse the deathly labyrinth in order to reach the TARDIS. Which you'll also need to use your imagination on, as it's actually a maze, not a labyrinth. However, the one thing more deadly than the worms in this level are the controls to the game. Whoever thought having ZX, and / as the controls needs reporting to the Geneva Convention? The second stage is titled The Prison. Now, to differentiate itself from Frogger, the story goes that the Doctor's friend has been captured and imprisoned in the enemy castle. Who exactly your friend is, let alone the enemy, is never explained. So the Doctor must traverse across an intergalactic freeway populated by 1960s spaceships, then across a space river filled with children's drawings of the Loch Ness Monster, then across another freeway, this time filled with 1950s spaceships and reversing tartan pencils, before finally planting a bomb in each of the prison's conveniently placed dugouts. Do this 5 times, and the level is over. Again, the controls are a pain, but this time it's down to the BBC Micro's lack of graphical power, causing jerky graphics and a terrible frame rate. Also the programmer forgetting that Frogger is set to a grid, so he can be killed by things nowhere near you. The third level is The Pterodactyls, where the Doctor has unfortunately parked the TARDIS on the edge of a cliff and has fallen into the abyss Wile E. Coyote style. True to the show's consistency of only letting the Doctor die from long falls if there's ever need of a change of actor, he survives totally unharmed and conveniently finds a UFO to slowly make his way back up the cliff. And people accuse Russell T Davies of filling the show with Deus Ex Machinas. But yep, as you can tell, this level rips off Space Invaders. or Demon Attack on Atari 2600 if you want to be pedantic about it. But unlike those two games, this level differs by rather having the enemies attack faster and faster with each wave, you simply move closer to them. In all fairness, no other game has done this before, but that's for good reason, because it's a bloody stupid idea. Whilst on paper it sounds like it makes the game 100 times harder, it's actually the total opposite. You can simply spam the hell out of the fire button, eliminated 90% of the monsters straight away, and the rest you can slowly pick off due to the fact you're so close to them that their attacking arc is so wide, so you can simply hide in the corners until you get a clear shot at them. So while this is probably the shortest level in the game, once you get the hang of it, it's ironically also the most fun too. The final level in the game is also the most confusing. Imagine playing battleships inside a Rubik's Cube that's been flattened out and by only using 3-dimensional sonar pings to detect the enemy. Got that? Well no, neither do I. It's like battleships like I said, but you not only have to give X and Y coordinates, but also Z. So it's like battleships, but playing 3 of them at the same time, one on top of each other. So if you can get your head around that, then more power to you. So while Doctor Who The First Adventure was the first official Doctor Who video game, press at the time were far less positive about it, pointing out that it just being a clone of other games had it bear very little resemblance to the show, and could really have been any licence. So along with that, and the sharp decline in sales after Peter Davidson left the show after only a few months of the game being on sale, eventually led to The First Adventure being the free bundled game with the later BBC Microsystems to help shift stock. However, the Beeb had listened to the complaints. So 2 years later, in 1985, their next attempt at a Doctor Who game was far more faithful to the show. Possibly too much. Released as a text-based adventure, Doctor Who and the Warlord is quite possibly the closest the BBC could make to an authentic Doctor Who experience, given the technology of the time. For those of you uninitiated with text-based adventures, imagine trying to play an RPG in Braille. So rather than the visual perspectives of your world, you're given short paragraphs to describe where you are, and you enter simple text commands, such as north, south, etc. to move, and phrases such as pick up, talk, take, and so on, to interact with the world. Warlord is a 2-part adventure. You play as an unnamed assistant who has become separated from an also unnamed doctor, most likely Colin Baker though, and must traverse on a war-torn alien planet using your keyboarding wits to save you from hundreds of instant deaths. And Part 2 has you travelling back to the Battle of Waterloo to fight Napoleon, who has become allies with the mysterious Warlord. As you can see from this footage, text adventures aren't the most thrilling of visual experiences. Even the packaging can't escape this, as its greatest boast is that it only takes 12 minutes to load. Yes, 12 minutes to load was considered lightning fast in 1985. It is rather puzzling as to why the BBC decided to release a 100% text-only adventure in 1985. 3 years previously, Melbourne House had revolutionised the genre with The Hobbit, by including large graphics into the game, and by 1985 had began to evolve into very early point-and-click adventures. So to say that Warlord was old hat by then is like someone today trying to release Pac-Man to compete with modern first-person shooters. In fact, the only innovative thing that the Beeb discovered while making this game was to not instantly date the game by sticking the Doctor's mug on the box. A trend that will continue in the games right up until the David Tennant era in the mid-noughties. Sadly, due to the game being a BBC Micro exclusive, as well as declining interest in the series, Warlord would be the final Doctor Who title to be published by the BBC. It wouldn't be until the release of Doctor Who The Eternity Clock on the PlayStation 3 and Vita, a whopping 29 years later, would the Beeb have another crack at the self-publishing whip. But we'll cross that bridge in a future episode. Amazingly released just a few months after the release of Warlord, Doctor Who and the Mines of Terror cast you in the Technicolor Dreamcoat of Colin Baker, the 6th Doctor. Well, that or Beetlejuice, judging by the main character's sprite, in what can finally be called a proper Doctor Who game. Originally meant to be the sequel to the BBC micro game Castle Quest, the development team, Micropower, halfway through development, did a bit of a Doki Doki Panic on Castle Quest 2 and slapped the Doctor Who licence on top, and thus was born Doctor Who: The Mines of Terror. What at first glance appears to be a bog standard platform game is anything but. Mines of Terror is actually a rather fiendish trial and error platforming puzzle game, with even some very early Metroidvania element thrown in for good measure. Ironic, considering neither Metroid nor Castlevania existed when this game was released. Also, if you haven't noticed by now, none of the previous official Doctor Who games contained any of the other named characters from the series, most notably the villains. This is really down to the BBC only owning the rights to a few characters, so rather than seek permission from their respected owners, Mines of Terror contains impromptu rip-offs of the enemies. Doctor Who rip-offs in an official Doctor Who game? Who'da thunk? So the Doctor's faithful robot hound, K9, became his faithful feline, Splinks.
Splink!
No, Splinks. And the Daleks became these weird caterpillar-tracked looking things called controllers. But as I said before, this is a rather complicated puzzle game. Not only just down to the myriad of extra buttons assigned to the keyboard to do stuff, but also having to program Splinks.
Splink!
That's not even funny anymore. Having to program Splinks is like programming one of those 80s big track toys. You need to carry him to his starting position, lay down markers in places where you want him to move to, and then move to a programming screen to enter exactly what you want him to do. Maybe it's just the modern gamer in me, but it does feel unnecessarily complicated and would have been a lot easier if the Doctor could just control him via remote control with his sonic screwdriver or something. Though admittedly, being able to lob a cat across the screen is rather entertaining. Oh come on, it's a robot cat! The Mines of Terror was also in development for the ZX Spectrum and the BBC Micro, which ironically was the reason why Micropower got the licence in the first place. But due to the sheer size of the game, it needed to be released as a mega game. Anyone out there who has never heard of a mega game before, it was an infamous British term for games with specs way beyond that of the system it was intended for, and would be supplied with an additional graphical or RAM cartridge / chip. These proved to be incredibly expensive, quadrupling the price of the game and literally bankrupted any company who had dared tried it before. Sadly, this was the same fate to bestow Micropower. The sheer cost of potentially developing these additional RAM cartridges, and the price of the Doctor Who licence in the first place, forced Micropower to declare bankruptcy, with the Mines of Terror being their final ever game. But Mines of Terror is a great Doctor Who game, an overlooked classic. It's just a shame that it never saw the light of day outside the UK. That, my friends, is what the Doc had to offer us gamers in the 80s. Be sure to tune in to the extended edition of this video coming soon, as well as the next episode where I'll be looking at what the 1990s had to offer us Whovians. And if you like what you saw, drop me a subscription, and maybe check out my other retrospectives on obscure British video games. But I'll be seeing you next time. I've been Guru Larry. Goodbye and good gaming.
There's a challenging adventure game for use with the BBC microcomputer called Doctor Who and the Warlord, with over 250 locations in each part, and a useful save and retrieve facility to enable you to save and load your last position, and the cassette costs £7.95.